We are live on the Hannibal TV on YouTube with a very special guest, a returning guest, a man who has really made a mark not only in terms of his authorship and filmmaking, but very successful podcasting. And we're here today to take a look at a very timely topic in light of the Manson documentary that dropped a couple of days ago on Netflix, specifically the speculative, I want to say, link between the CIA MKULTRA program and the rise of serial killers in the late 1960s into the 70s. And I would be talking about none other than William Ramsey of William Ramsey Investigates. Welcome again to the Hannibal TV, William.
Jack, thanks for having me. Great to be with you again.
Before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of what MKUltra was and the details related to serial killers, that whole murky kind of web, I wanted to ask you, just in terms of a serendipitous timing, that Manson doc dropped on Netflix, and I found it was interesting that they were discussing, openly some facets of MKUltra, figures like Jolly West and mind control, etc. What did you make of this? Another revelation of the method type deal, or what do you think?
I thought it was interesting. I do think that they kind of covered some of the known stuff about Manson, but I think going into the stuff about Jolly West and Manson's coercive control of his followers was interesting. Like, he had 30 followers. And the fact that he seemed to come in and out of jail at strange times was telling, and kind of ties in to the whole name of the book, really, Chaos, which is this Operation Chaos, CIA operation. But I would have liked to have seen them address even larger elements or larger contexts of these kind of cases. Because in California, there was this place, this Symbionese Liberation Army, that I believe was also an Operation Chaos operation. That was 74, 5 years later. But I wish they would have kind of put the Manson events within the context of other incidences like that, and other serial killings that involve drugs and coercion and a lot of cults. So they kind of left out stuff. They mentioned Scientology, but they didn't go into detail about that. So I think it was kind of a hit or miss. I enjoyed watching it, but Errol Morris is a very famous documentary director. And at least it kind of, you kind of wonder, is this the full story, or is this at least planting a seed in the public? Maybe they don't know as much about that. So from a planting the seed perspective, I think it was a success.
Yeah, I agree with you, though. It seems like they were selective in their material that they included, and it seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Maybe that was by design, but at least you don't get a more mainstream platform to be discussing what was considered conspiratorial in the past.
Yeah, well, I think that's well said. I mean, it really, like I said, this is really, people can see it now. I think it came out March 7th. So it was just 3 days ago. And it did address it. I think the general public may not know Jolly West. So at least they're bringing up a known MKUltra asset and explaining he had there was documents that tied him to these people, like the poisoner in Chief Gottlieb, and that he was doing a lot of experiments and stuff like that. There's a larger issue behind that guy, because he did studies into, a lot of people, public may not know this, but the hippie movement before the Manson family. So I think that O'Neill talked about that they were studying this hippie movement in a safe house in Haight-Ashbury, and then all of a sudden Manson pops up there. And the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, too, one thing that I wish they'd have added is that the Haight-Ashbury Clinic under Smith, where Manson was in his troop of women, they were also studying the effects of drugs on people. So Jolly West studied LSD. This guy Smith was studying methamphetamine. And then you have in the documentary, they're mentioning on the night of the murders at Cielo Drive, where they killed Sharon Tate, they're on meth. They're very violent. And so what they studied at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic is methamphetamines. There's a correlation between meth usage and ultra violence, and you see that played out in Manson. So how much of that is known? How much did Manson know? I think they speculated there at the end, but I think that Manson, they left out the part where Manson is associated with the Process Church and a lot of the kind of darker elements of the Manson and the kind of people that Polanski was around and Sharon Tate. So it was a hit and miss for me in that documentary.
Mm-hmm. Agree. Can you explain for those that may not be initiated what exactly the MKUltra program was?
The MKUltra program started in 1953. It was came out of the interests in kind of what was known as the mind control gap. They actually thought there was a mind control gap between the U.S. and the Soviets. And so after World War II, the Cold War is beginning, and the U.S. wants to compete. And so they think that there's events happening in the Iron Curtain that indicated some people had been controlled. So they wanted their own kind of investigation or rallied for it. And so John Dulles gave a kind of an infamous speech in Virginia in 53 called Brain Warfare. You can read it online. It's covered in a really good book called The Devil's Chessboard by Talbot. He has a chapter on the brain warfare. A week later, MKUltra rolls out from the CIA, right? Because Dulles is the head. He has a brother, infamous brother, who's the head of Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. So they have very powerful couple. And Dulles' history is really interesting. It's another show. Anyway, they decided on 149 sub-projects, and it becomes almost something like the Manhattan Project. If you remember the Manhattan Project that created the atom bomb, this MKUltra was spread out through all kinds of already existing entities, universities, hospitals, etc. And it was to study on a wide variety of topics, different sub-projects. I think they actually mentioned a sub-project in the documentary Chaos that Jolly West was involved, so Project 39. But it was really to try to study the human mind, drugs, effective drugs, sociological techniques. And it was really this kind of, it was called, and taking place in this golden age of psychiatry, this kind of growth in psychiatric knowledge, drugs, and things like that. So one of the aims, and this actually precedes MKUltra, was to create a mind control assassin and see if they could do that. And there were a couple of projects before MKUltra in 53. There was a guy before Dulles, his name was Morse Allen. He actually studied the effects of psilocybin, magic mushrooms before 53. But there were two projects called Bluebird and Artichoke. So these projects were there. They were top secret. And so MKUltra was very broadly done. Some of it is known to the public. Most of the names of the sub-projects are known. And a lot of the experiments, a lot of them are known, and they were secretly financed through front groups, shady front groups. It's almost like USAID that we see today. But imagine this network of front groups financing different thinkers and doctors. There were things that happened in Canada. Ewan Cameron was his name. These are very auspicious, skilled psychiatrists with doctorates. Ewan Cameron was the head of the World Psychiatric Association or something. Like, he was really a huge international bigwig, also doing really dark mind control experiments to see if they could control people. He was involved in depatterning. He called it psychic driving, where he would put you in a room with heavy drugs and repeat phrases through, audio things in your ear or something. And he learned a lot. And a lot of those people came out and sued and actually won a judgment against McGill University. There, a lot of people's minds were wrecked. So the MKUltra had, it's a very broad thing, but they really were trying, and one part of it was to try to make a programmed people, really, is really one of the elements. So there's a real question of whether they succeeded or not.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk a little bit about that Manchurian Candidate concept and some of the links between the MKUltra program and Nazism and some of their research, etc. Because I don't think that's as widely known as it should be. I've heard you speak about it, of course, on your show, but could you just give a primer on that, please?
The Nazis were involved in a lot of this kind of mind control and experimentation, and we know of things like the Angel of Death. I forgot what his Dr. Mengele, but some of these guys have came out. So we people might be familiar with the paperclip program, where people like Werner von Braun were brought across to the U.S. He worked on the rocketry system or the moon landing, but there were other doctors, and they had been studying. And actually, there's a lot of cases of these Nazis, believe it or not, that haven't hit the Western world, or the U.S., that were involved in hypnotized cases and manipulating people in kind of after World War II. And so some of those doctors were brought over and were associated with famous assassinations in the United States. And one actually was involved in close to the killing of Martin Luther King. And his name was von Koss, Koss, a literal Nazi doctor. Who was the killer? Who was the guy who supposedly shot MLK? It was I can't remember his name now, but the supposed shooter of MLK was under the tutelage for a minute or for a while in LA under an actual ex-Nazi brain scientist. So they did come over. There were studies. Some of that information was bled over to the United States, and some of those people. And Dulles was during World War II. He was in Switzerland, kind of running agents through Nazi Germany against Hitler's regime. So he was familiar with a lot of that stuff. And there's a lot more information. There's a lot more research to be done on my side about him, but there definitely is something. There's argument, if you remember kind of Nazi history leading up to World War II, there was the infamous burning down of the Reichstag, which happened in 1933. It was the excuse for Hitler and the Nazis to really accrue total power in Germany. They blamed it on the communists and this young man named Martin van der Lubbe, or van der Lug, or I think was his name. But there are people who have looked into his case, and they think that he might have been a mind control patsy because he acted very strange, like he was drugged. And this is in 1933. And some of this information, a lot of the studies and even the precursors to MKUltra go all the way back to the 19th century. They're like the word mesmerism we have here is actually based on a guy, Mesmer, who was a hypnotist. And then also like Esterbrook is one of the earlier kind of hypnotist, kind of MK type doctors, published some of his earlier books in 1935. And they were actually, interestingly, J. Edgar Hoover was aware of Esterbrook's in the 30s, so before World War II. So this history of MKUltra is really just a chapter, and there's earlier chapters in this kind of quest for the Manchurian Candidate. And it's interesting because in McGowan's book, Program to Kill, one of the first chapters is about Esterbrook. So the great Dave McGowan keys into Esterbrook as a key figure in this kind of theme that you're talking about, mind control and serial killers. So I think that book, I mean, McGowan was way ahead of his time and deserves all the credit he can, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're going to talk about one aspect of McGowan's book, but yeah, when you consider how long ago that was published, it's kind of startling. Can you talk about how MKUltra might have influenced individuals who later became serial killers, and some of the known, you're talking about hypnotism here, but some of the other known methods that they would employ in their experiments?
Well, there's been a lot of interesting things associated with warfare and Project Phoenix, which was in Vietnam, and people who've come out of that who've become serial killers. One is Richard Ramirez, who has associated with somebody from the Phoenix program. There's also other guys who have come out of the military who've gone on to be really vicious killers and mentioned in Program to Kill. One was Heidnik, was his name. He was kind of a female collector, very dark figure. We know Jeffrey Dahmer was in the military in Germany, of all places, where there's like stories that confirm there's things going on in Germany pertaining to these experiments, which would make sense because they're happening on military bases. They're not in the United States, but they're actually optimal places to carry out covert activities overseas because there's no oversight like there is in the States. So a lot of these guys, there's a lot of these types of people who went on to be like full on stone cold serial killers. Let's see, who else is there?
Shawcross.
Shawcross, yeah, he was Phoenix too, right? So he came out of the Vietnam War, really vicious guy. I'm trying to think who else. Like there were other. I think there's just a long list of guys with very strange backgrounds who were involved in the military, who went on to become serial killers. There's no question about it. I'm trying to figure out my list. Like Gacy was strange too. So how many of these guys had kind of connections to this underground is a good question.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the trauma-based mind control and the use, the omnipresent use or proliferation of narcotics in these experiments, what models are they trying to connect between specifically trauma? Because McGowan talks about in his book how so many of these individuals that we've even mentioned so far seem to require or have that traumatic childhood background, and that is the I believe he called it the blooding part to set them forward on a path of serial killing, and they were perhaps selected as a result of their backgrounds. Can you expand on that a little bit?
One of the ways to like get these people to break down their personality or change their personality is through trauma. So that's where that whole word comes from. So it's the infliction of intentional trauma on people to create kind of barriers in their brain. And it actually goes back to Esterbrook's. He actually talked about partitioning the mind. And he had kind of benign kind of usages for that partition, which were kind of like to have secret information you could transport from one person to another. And one of the characters, interesting, I think his name was Nagel, who was associated with the JFK killing. He was actually a person that is verifiable person who had that kind of procedure done to him. He was a member of kind of like the deep state, but infamously he walked into a bank. Nagel walked into a bank. He knew Oswald, by the way, but he walked into a bank and shot up the bank and said they're going to kill the president, and ended up in jail so that he could stay in jail during the shooting on November 22nd, 63 and not be implicated. But so those are the positive things. But the other trauma is to create separate personalities and fracture the mind, really schismogenesis. And a lot of times they've found really dark stuff where it's children and the younger are more susceptible to these types of things, as their brains are more pliable and still growing and things like that. So that's the whole thing about this kind of trauma of an early age that affects people. And I think even Freud keyed into that. His early childhood trauma would affect people later in life. So I think that's kind of the goal of this trauma-based mind control, is to really do horrible things. And there's really horrible stories of this stuff. And some of this stuff is verified, like the Finders cult, where they had young kids around. That's all kind of been verified. And other things, some of these child trafficking things, and that are even probably happening today. Some of those kids have went through really horrible abuse, and their brains are fractured, actually, from some of these other cults too, like Children of God and things like that. So I think that that's really kind of it, is like it creates this trauma, and then they manipulate the brain and try to exacerbate that trauma into like acts of violence and things like that.
Which kind of leads well into my next question, and that is there seems to be I keep saying rise, but a coming out of proliferation of dissociative disorder, or at least the excuse me, the psychiatric attention to it, multiple personality disorder in the 70s. And it appears anyway, at least you look at some of the assassin types like Sirhan that, indicated that he had no memory of this, et cetera, et cetera. what in terms of that linkage do you see as a crucial component to creating a Manchurian candidate or serial killer, so to speak?
I think it's provable. Like this guy, Sirhan disappeared into a hospital he was gone for 6 weeks. So a lot of these guys have had time in hospital that's very suspicious. Leading up to the present, Mangione, the same thing. Like he was in the hospital for a while for a pretty serious back surgery. If you remember, that's the guy who killed the United Health CEO in New York City. But other people have been in there, like Oswald. There's actually some speculation whether Oswald was part of these programs. He was in the hospital for a long period of time on a very suspicious charge of sexually transmitted disease. So he supposedly had an STD that required this kind of like long period of time in the hospital. Chapman was in and out of the hospital, the killer of Lenin. So a lot of these guys have that. And so they're either created as assassins or as patsies. And the study of Sirhan is really interesting. The other thing is what's also interesting about all these guys is their connection to people like Jolly and West. And there is a connection between Sirhan and Chapman. Both had the same doctor, 13, 14 years apart. This guy, Bernard Diamond, who was a known hypnotist, and diagnosed them with paranoid schizophrenia. But it is interesting. That's a convenient cover if they were tampered with for nefarious means by some MKUltra program that we don't see. People said that there was these huge kind of like governmental bodies investigating this stuff in the 70s, right? There was the Church Committee, who ended up ruining his career, and then he died suspiciously of cancer. That looked into all this stuff, and I think one of the heads of the CIA came out and said they burned all the documents, but I don't believe them. I don't believe anything the CIA says. Actually, they lie so frequently you can believe the opposite. But so some of these programs will never know this. It's top secret. These are all compartmentalized. So, but I do think that there's a good evidence that these guys are all remnants. I think that Henry Lee Lucas was another one who was in the hospital for a long period of time, comes to mind, in strange hospitals. And a lot of these guys are working in hospitals. Like there's weird connections between people. They were trying to take Oswald to a state hospital. He was seen with David Ferry and the one guy who was sued by Garrison at a state hospital. Like, what's going on? So Oswald was a really strange guy, and in the mold of somebody like Chapman, who somebody is watching over him and he's moving around in strange ways almost his whole life. So he wasn't I think he was a patsy. He didn't shoot anybody on November 22nd, 1963, but some of these other guys really are killers. Like there was a spike in killers. I did an interview with a guy named Vronsky, who details this spike, this spike that literally went up in the 60s, went through the 70s and down in the 80s in the United States. There's a known scientifically provable spike in serial killings. And it's a big question as to why that is. What happened during that time that people were going crazy, just killing people left and right? Like here in LA at that time, there was the Freeway Killer. There was this guy Kraft who killed literally 100 people. There were the Hillside Stranglers. So there's just like a real question as to why they speak. Now, I think there was a lot going on, a lot of LSD, drugs. And I think that those were all studied. They were studied in the 50s. And I think people the government knew their effects. And there's pretty good evidence, at least in LSD, that the government was involved in their distribution, LSD in particular, throughout the United States.
Yeah, you touched on the concept of a patsy, and in Program to Kill, McGowan, really delineated two archetypes of a killer, and that being a controlled patsy and an assassin. Could you expand on that and what the purpose of both of them were, and then we could look at some of the curious legal differences between the two in terms of their processing?
Well, I think that a lot of people think that a lot of these people committed the assassination. At least they're told by the government media. Oswald, Sirhan. The other one was James Earl Ray, who came out of literally was released from a hospital, much like Manson. You want to talk about a coinciding case like the Chaos case? James Earl Ray was known to be in a hospital. He was released conveniently and then shows up in Memphis, and he probably didn't do the shooting. So these guys, these are Chapman probably didn't do the shooting according to the book I read about Whelan. And there's questions about whether Hinckley fired the lethal shot. I'm pretty sure that Bremer fired the shot that hurt Wallace. That was a very important political killing that the taxi driver was based on. So those are all a mix. Mostly those are all patsies, I think. These patsy, and somebody else comes in behind and does the killing, and then they lie about it in the public. That's the governmental MO when they target something. I think Lenin was targeted for execution for a long period of time, and Reagan, if he died, the beneficiary would have been George H.W. Bush. So I think that there's that distinction about who's really shooting, but it's very convenient to have, like, when these like for me, the killing of JFK is thousands of people are involved in it. They all got in, and it's not some kind of small operation because it pervaded the entire system, systemically pervaded the entire system of the United States. So a lot of people wanted him dead, but it's very convenient to have this kind of patsy, much like Oswald said he was a patsy, have patsies in place to take the blame for actually acts of state. And so the list of patsies is really far longer than we may know. And like much like this strange guy, Brian Ruth, who was the second Trump killer, attempted killer. I don't know if you remember, that was the one that had supposedly happened. Yeah, the golf course. Strange guy from Oahu, like, around the same time as Luigi Mangione and Chapman. They're literally all on Oahu. Why are they all from Oahu? And then they spread out. And Mangione literally shows up and does his killing 20 blocks from Chapman, where Chapman supposedly shot Lennon. Like, these are very strange things. But Ruth, much like James Earl Ray, much like Oswald, moving around. James Earl Ray had this secret guy who gave him money. He called him Luis. Yeah, Raul was his code name. But like, he was moving around. He went for Canada. He wasn't arrested, by the way. People don't know that. But like, the killing of MLK happened, and they got James Earl Ray, I think, out of the country. So he wasn't arrested for another 6 weeks. And that's a really sketchy. He's very strange, like Sirhan. Very strange background. And these guys are all the same age. It's very strange correlation between the age groups. Sirhan, 24. Oswald, 24. Chapman, 25 or 26. These guys are all around their mid-20s, which is also weird. Mangione, 26, I think. So there are a mix. I think most of these so-called killers are really patsies, and the real killers, like, it's a kind of provable. I think that the medical examiner of L.A., he was a Japanese guy, said that the kill shot for JFK came behind his head from about an inch. That was so. We know Sirhan was always in the front of RFK. So, it's just like there's people put in place to finish it and people that take the blame.
Yeah, which kind of dovetails into something else when I mean, with the Trump assassination attempts in last year, I think for the first time you heard people in the media, saying, the official narrative is here's a lone gunman again, and people, in the mainstream rolling their eyes and going, give me a break. But why is there this this emphasis, do you think, on serial killers being, the lone wolf, as opposed to, like, in some of these cases outlined in McGowan's book, they couldn't possibly have, Bundy being one, they couldn't have possibly committed the murder, such as in the sorority house, on his own. But yet that's the official narrative. And then the second part of that question, which kind of relates as well, is the reliance on, well, this, when we're looking for serial killer X, they have an MO, and they pick the same victims, they use the same weapons, the same location, when that is proven to be untrue, and certain evidentiary materials, such as in the Ramirez case, are excluded because it doesn't fit that MO. So that's a very multifaceted question, but
I think it's easier. I think it's easier for them to cut and dried. I think that one example, I think that's in McGowan's book, is the Atlanta child murders, where they found the guy. It's easy. Everybody gets to high five, shake hands, and it's cleaned up. But I think there were some deaths that happened after he was arrested. So it takes away this whole network element that cops don't really want to deal with, much like Berkowitz too, right? They don't want to consider that it's some kind of group event. It's too scary to think about that. So I think that there's an incentive by police to have very clean cases where they don't have to go to the public and say there may be other people involved, because that would just exacerbate the fear. I think Berkowitz and his crew were trying to create the fear, and I think they did that. So I think it's a police incentive, and I think that's kind of they want something clean, cut, and dried. And I think the same thing happens in kind of my smiley face killings research, is like, it's not an organized group working or moving around. It's just he drowned, and there we can wash our hands and just literally walk away like Pontius Pilate. We don't have to be responsible for anything. So I think that this is the kind of I think that criminals, the sophisticated ones, play on that. Like, they know that the police are going to respond in this certain way. And they have in the past. They did it in Berkowitz for sure, and Atlanta, which was definitely probably more than one person. And I've seen other cases. Randy Kraft was another one, 100 deaths. And we know that like certain events in those deaths, like somebody had to throw the body out the window, 150-pound body. So somebody who's driving a car couldn't do that at the same time. So somebody else involved. There's another guy, Eiler, who was a gay serial killer in the Midwest. Is he with other people? So I think it's just like it's a approach of law enforcement to just like have a cut and dried case. I think it's a lot easier for them than actually say, hey, there may be other people involved. I've actually seen that in the Yosemite sightseer murders. There were 3 girls, and they just put it on one guy, Stainer. And it was a lot easier to do that than say, hey, other people may have been there, transported them, abused them for a long period of time, and did it, than to just, hey, we got Stainer, it's over, let's move forward.
Yeah, and McGowan kind of hints at, in some situations, which we'll expand a little bit more when we talk about prosecutions, that it may be a really dark situation where there's official, I want to say, allowance for these type of things. But we'll get into that in a minute.
It's a good question. Sorry to interrupt, but follow on. Look at how many of these cases of these assassins, the proceedings are sketchy. So even in kind of like the shooting of RFK, like the whole legal proceedings is a disaster. Other ones, the person who's charged conveniently pleads guilty, much like Chapman, so they don't even have to have a trial. There's no evidence shown or anything. Hey, pled guilty. We don't know why, but we're done. So some of these cases don't follow the normal procedures of like this long-term thing where somebody's like trying to defend themselves. It's very strange.
Yeah, I think I'll skip ahead to that aspect that I was going to ask you, and that's like when you're looking at the prosecution of these cases, McGowan points out numerous high-profile trials where you're having experts, in multiple trials. The individual isn't allowed to really, give any type of a defense. The evidence, quote unquote, that's used to convict some of these individuals is questionable at best. Is that, in your opinion? And I know McGowan again speculated that this might be a larger, darker sort of situation, but is this again an instance where I want to say prosecutorial misconduct is allowed to wrap the case up, prevent the public from panicking, or is it something else? Because the similarities between some of those high profile cases, it's just the same experts testify across many trials.
Yeah, they do. Like, I mean, West Memphis 3 is a good example, something I've studied in detail. They had this one expert that shows up all over the place. But yeah, I think that some of these, like I think McGowan goes into the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo. Like, that was kind of fixed. Like, they just said it was him. He did all these cases when there was evidence to the other. That's a perfect example of just getting one guy and not looking into the deeper elements. But there's weird things behind that case too. That was one of Bailey's, the guy who was in the O.J. Simpson case, one of his first cases. So there's an incentive to, like, you know, have it cut and dried. There was hypnotism involved in that case. There's hypnotism involved in more post World War II big cases than you'd be surprised. But that was one of them that actually William Joseph Bryant hypnotized Albert DeSalvo. Maybe had a deliberate outcome. And there may have been, like, the government may actually know what's really going on, but we're going to just fix this proceeding. So I think that there are larger interests involved in making sure these convictions take place, much like Atlanta. I think it's too disturbing to think that there's a large group of people abducting and raping kids than, you know, just having one guy take the hit for it. So I think that in a lot of these urban areas, I mean, I think we've seen it writ large over at least in the States in the last 4 years, they're super corrupt. So some of these proceedings, even recently, are very corrupt. What are they like in the past? And I think Sirhan comes to mind for me, because for me, he obviously didn't do it. Even the family, even the Kennedy family, I think, has come out and said there's no way he shot my dad or my uncle or something like that. So you have some of these proceedings are you have to question, like, what happened. Much like James Earl Ray, like, there's been other cases. I think William Pepper kind of retried the Martin Luther King thing, and, like, in a civil court, and they're like, yeah, James Earl Ray didn't do it. So I think, there's patsies all over the place that took the blame for government action, and the government was more than happy to allow these patsies to take the blame. And it's really, in a much larger context, it's actually the rewriting of a false history. It really is fake history, because I think a lot of these guys were threats to people, the oligarchy in power at the time, and the oligarchy moved together to, you know, have these patsies take the blame for killings that they wanted done. 60s was very bloody, very strange things happened, and a lot of weird mind control stuff. In the Martin Luther King case too, a lot of people don't know this, but his brother, who was Martin Luther King's brother, was a good swimmer. He drowned in his pool within a year of his death. And somebody else walked into a church. He was dropped off by some mystery person and walked in and shot Martin Luther King's mom in a church, a black guy. And another, he might have actually done it, but they were under a lot of pressure. So I think that family, they were killed by a lot. I mean, it's kind of a whole nother show. It goes back to J. Edgar Hoover knowing Esther Brooks in the 30s and having, like, there's this incredibly released documents of 800 pages of him and all of his buddies in the FBI talking to Esther Brooks, and Esther Brooks explaining hypnotism and how you can create these type of things. So J. Edgar Hoover's right in the mix of all these deaths in the 60s, and all these patsies are, you know, either or killers are there. It's really that's the real history. And all this stuff about these guys actually doing it for whatever random reason they are, Hinckley and Chapman and James Earl Ray, are fictitious.
Yeah, and one of the the epicenters which you've talked about a lot on your show is the state of California, and specifically the Laurel Canyon facility. Could you just briefly lay that particular aspect out for the viewers, because I think it's germane.
Yeah, I think that's the Laurel Canyon is kind of like the culture creation. That's another book by, McGowan. weird scenes inside the canyon, which is this connection between kids who came from military intelligence or wealthy families creating the culture of the 60s. And the list is long. Like, he really went into a lot of stuff. But it's like there was this old kind of facility at the top of Laurel Canyon that was really a facility that could put out government propaganda pieces. And it's still there today. It's owned by Jared Leto. But it is really something else that he kind of keyed into, how many of these guys, whether it's Crosby or Zappa or so many of these other characters involved in the music industry, came from wealthy families or military intelligence. Jim Morrison. They're all the nexus is really a very small area of Los Angeles. It really is incredible. And it's very close to kind of like where the whole Manson thing went down. It's one canyon over. So there's Laurel Canyon, and then it's I can't remember the other one. It's just like a stone's throw from that whole area. But yeah, it's a great book, the Weird Scenes book. They mention it on Joe Rogan, but they won't mention Dave McGowan's name, which is pretty funny. So they've had like 3 guests who have mentioned Weird Scenes inside the canyon without mentioning McGowan's name. So.
Yeah, very, very interesting, considering the entertainment industry connection there. Can you just address the another I guess emerging concept, really following the John Benet Ramsey of the profiling aspect, the profiling profession, and how sometimes in these cases it can be more of a hindrance than not looking at, for example, Wayne Williams in the Atlanta child murders again.
Yeah, I don't know Wayne Williams. I don't know the profile, if it was right or what the situation was, but I do know, like, John Douglas is mentioned in Program to Kill, but I know John Douglas is supposedly a famous profiler. He's had this whole show on Netflix, much like Chaos on there. Was it Mind Walker or Mind whatever? But his profiling, he's made mistakes on the Green River Killer. He made a mistake on that one and the West Memphis 3. He actually got the mess. I mean, I can say this for a fact. I've written a document about it, but he's either a paid asset, which is possible, but he's actually done a disservice, I mean, for the West Memphis 3, in my opinion. So this is supposedly kind of a vaunted figure, this kind of eminence in the legal profession, FBI agent, but he bungled the West Memphis 3 bad. And I put it in my book, Abomination. So I know that these guys can make mistakes and can get things wrong, and some of their analyses aren't correct, if at all. So there's and I think McGowan mentions Rensselaer, one of the earlier guys. So there are kind of like concerns. Like, I wouldn't take, if he's from the FBI, I wouldn't take him at face value. And some of these other analysts, I think, get things wrong too. There's a lot of very kind of, the true crime is the number one genre out there, and there's a lot of kind of armchair analysts out there who've gotten things wrong, in my opinion, on other cases. They had this one Riley Strain case, smiley face killing case that happened in, I think it was Nashville, and they just wrote it off as like an accidental drowning. Like, the guy didn't, like, he decided to supposedly take off his pants and keep his boots on or something, and then go for a swim. And they just said, oh, he just went out to urinate and drowned. Like, so there's a lot. You got to take a lot of these people's analyses with a grain of salt.
One aspect of the serial killer phenomenon that with the exception of a few, including Richard Ramirez right off the bat, is the seeming omnipresence of occult symbolism in these murders, and a U.S. military connection as well. And I'm thinking of Michael Aquino and the Presidio case, but it seems that I guess in his book, McGowan says, they had to acknowledge the occult symbolism in the case because Ramirez was flashing a pentagram all the time. But why do you think there's so much of that in these cases, and yet it doesn't seem to be reported on to the extent that it would be germane to the case?
It's a really good question. And I think it's consistently through a lot of these serial killing cases. Somebody, Corso, I think was the name of the author who traced Ramirez to the Church of Satan and LaVey. Like, nobody mentions that he was an actual member. So they don't want to come up with a correlation between Satanism or occultism and death. And I think and these serial killings, excuse me. And I think it's political, and I think it's cultural, and I think some people are afraid to be mocked about it, but it's there. It's all the way through. So many of these serial killing cases, these guys are talking to demons and have like all they're doing stuff. Even Bundy, there's an element there that he's associated with the black magic group in Washington that they kept out. They don't go into it. Danny Rawling is like, he's contacting a spirit called Gemini, who's like, he was the killer in Florida. So many of these guys, and Henry Lee Lucas is supposedly a group of the Black Hand group. So he's with Otis Toole. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There's so many of these guys. I mean, even we know Dahmer had an affinity for black magic. Like, I mean, it's included in this documentary that was on Netflix that he had the Satanic Bible. I mean, he certainly acted that way, like he was an active member. So why do they leave it out? And I think that's really, and the West Memphis 3 is a prime example where they just left it out of the public sphere. And I think it's like the Christian worldview of good and evil, Christ and the devil, that whole ideology, that whole theological construct, they don't even want to address that. And I think it's like, it's kind of people who are anti-Christian and also who are atheists, or, you know, people who are communists or whatever, materialists. They don't believe that. And I think that as kind of the Christian ethos recedes, that view has taken over, really. And then also, I think people are afraid of this kind of charged terms like satanic panic, which supposedly is like this. You're panicking if you say that Satanism is involved. But then when these people come out and say, I'm doing this because I love Satan and I love blood, like Ramirez, who literally said something like that and drew downward facing pentagrams on like places where he committed his murders and stuff. He was also a pedophile. Like, they literally like abducted little kids off the street and did horrible things. When the people don't want to acknowledge that. I mean, I think a lot of that satanic panic, in my experience, I've been kind of in the game for a while now. A lot of people pushing that concept are Satanists. So they're all occultists saying, hey, don't be afraid. And the reason they don't want that is because it's their religion. And I think it's a cover for the evil of kind of being a kind of a Satanist. So I think the national media, I mean, there are little glimmers that come out here and there. And a lot of my stuff, like, I kind of got my stuff exposing all that. Like, I literally, before I had William Ramsey Investigates, it was occult investigations because nobody was talking about it. But you kind of need to have like an evil desire, or like one of the 7 deadly sins, to commit these kind of heinous acts, whether it's lust or jealousy or anger, or a mix of all the others, to do these kind of horrible things to other people. And so I like I said, I think it's like an attempt not to acknowledge this kind of duality or theological duality. I think that's really it. Like, the world's just a random place and we're all blips on the cosmic scale, and, you know, nothing matters. It's materialism. And so I think that's the attitude that pervades the national media. At least it has in the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and just a sidebar, talking about Aquino again and the Presidio case, he was very open about his quote unquote religion, and it really, when you consider that he was an intelligence asset as well. First of all, it's unbelievable that you know, there weren't convictions forthcoming in that, and I know that he denied that till his last day. But is it not a real ethical quandary for a government organization, be it intelligence, military, to have open, proud satanic practitioners in it? And do you think that if that was more widely known, at least during that time frame. We can argue today it's the same. It's maybe a little more covert. That really isn't something that should be allowed in any government agency, or do you think we've gone too far with the whole freedom of religion thing?
It's a good question. I mean, they had to have known he kind of like was a pretty open and notorious member of an occult group. But I think it's kind of like freedom of religion. I think it's a First Amendment issue. So I think that's probably why he was allowed to do it. But I've also done research on Aquino, and like there was a very serious investigation of that guy and the Presidio stuff and the child abuse and all that those events. They didn't have enough to prosecute him, but he was denying it the whole time. But that's another kind of group model criminal activity type thing, almost like a RICO case, where a lot more people were involved. There were people who died of AIDS. There were kids. It was almost like a McMartin. But why he was allowed to kind of thrive in the American military is an open question. When he wrote books, he had this whole Temple of Set, this whole group. He wrote from PSYOP to Mind War, like literally having mind. Like this is the kind of environment we're in today. We're past kind of PSYOP. But he like promoted, and this is like the prescient kind of thing that he wrote that is in the kind of modern zeitgeist is really incredible. But yeah, he was a nasty guy. I did a show on him. I think he committed suicide when he was 72 or something like
that. Yeah, that's my understanding as well. In terms of, we seem to be in an age when, quote unquote conspiracy theory is becoming more mainstream for lack of a better term. But how do you balance when you're doing your research, for example, into some of these dark topics, the skepticism with trying to have an open inquiry, and then there's a lot of deliberate attempts to derail investigative inquiry with false information. For example, your great work on the West Memphis 3. What do you think is behind this more, at least, appearance of more disclosive information, and yet all the misinformation that's fed through the media, etc.?
I think it's about power and money and influence. So I think that people have to defend their stuff, whether it's a lie or truth or not. So I think it's kind of you're in an environment where you're going to have pushback, and you're going to have these other kind of false narratives, or false conspiracy theory, loaded term, satanic panic, loaded term, witch hunt, loaded term. What if you're a witch? Is it really a witch hunt? So I do think that people there's a mercantile, there's an economic element to the West Memphis 3. They were raising money. They were able to raise $10 or $20 million. So why would they want to just not address somebody who contradicted their views? And so think about these other views, like whether it's the shots or this war in Ukraine. There's so much money involved, hundreds of billions of dollars. Why would you come up and say, is Putin really the bad guy? Did Putin take half my taxes? Is he letting people in who could kill my kids and burn down my house, or, taking money or literally stealing from the public banks or whatever? Like, did Putin do that to me? So they have to, I think that's really the fight. And I think it's actually was really emphasized in very stark terms during the Biden regime, where they're literally in full-on information war, disinformation, misinformation, which is really subjective. Like if somebody's really trying to enforce that, it's a subjective standard or bias standard, whether you like it or not. If you're honest, I mean, everybody has their own biases. You never get away from bias, by the way, which is fine. But so I think that this kind, in some ways, the open discourse and open dialogue, it does have a lot of sparks fly, and there's tension and friction and heat. But out of that can come insight, clarity, and conclusions. So even though people may contradict in open speech, the process of free speech will out towards the truth. I think it's almost like the Socratic method, where you just keep talking and then it's like the truth. Well, this is eventually you're going to come out with like, this is actually what's going on. Is the earth flat? Well, let's try to figure it out. Is the climate changing and we're all going to drown? Well, let's talk about it. They've been saying the same thing for 50 years. I see the ocean is at the same level. So what's going on? So I think the people who move against free speech are against human liberty, human cognition, human individuality, and against the best interest of any individual. So I think like it's a bummer to have people contradict you, have PR. I've like had PR agents come after me. I have clearly fake postings on social media. I've definitely had these porn bots put on my posts so that they're degraded, So like if the system sees that there's a porn, like, hey, come to my OnlyFans website, they'll like discount it as something viable to look at. So I think those are problems, but I do think that it's free speech is like, it's a principle of a free society. It's just is. And who doesn't want to be free? Like, so you have to put up with like all the naysayers. And like I said, you get these conclusions where like, oh, you're foolish crap. Climate change is, I mean, I've researched climate change. It's the biggest joke. Al Gore is a total liar. He's a total piece of junk. So that's just one example.
In terms of your podcast, you've talked about how there are, subsequent CIA programs that are unconfirmed or alleged, such as Monarch. And I've heard you state that, the mind control is now omnipresent in society. What did you mean by that for this discussion?
Well, I think that's really it. That's how they're going to coerce people to do what they want. And I think that this mind control is something that people need to acknowledge and see. And so they see, like, I mean, perfect example is all this USAID money that's behind the curtain, creating literal fake groups of people to protest and supporting certain organizations that you think are independent but aren't. Supporting politicians that you think independent or aren't. And so I think that's all for coercion. I think all the polls are propaganda. The US polls are fake as heck. And the parity between the right and the left is fake. That's also another element of mind control. I think that the real support of the Democratic Party in the United States is closer to 30%. But they keep putting it out there because the ballots are fake too. And they're all fraudsters. Clinton and Obama are involved in massive fraud. So I think that this environment of mind control, like it just goes to, psyop to mind control, where it's just you're being bombarded with so many psyops that it's actually mind war. So I think there's a war against the human mind for whatever reason people want. They either hate humanity, or they're trying to create a new world order, or they want people back into a feudalistic slave state where they're eating out of their hand. For whatever reason, it's still going on. And I think that it's malevolent. I think the people in control, whether it leads back to the king, who was literally had his portrait with him holding a sword and a literal monarch butterfly on his shoulder, which I think is incredibly telling because he's behind a lot of this sustainability and all this stuff. So I think that you have to see through all these lies for your own cognitive stability and literally your survival, because some of these lies, mind control is the biggest force multiplier imaginable, because you don't have to pay for weapons, you don't have to pay for resources, you just barrage somebody's brain to give them false information, and they'll make mistakes to their own detriment, whether they put resources to this baloney towards climate change, which is a huge money laundering thing. I mean, you can see it played out through Podesta's stuff. So this whole thing about mind control is what everybody should know. It should be almost an elementary class in an elementary, schools, like reading, writing, grammar, rhetoric, or mind control. Like they used to have this, the classics would teach rhetoric, which is, argumentation and verbal and oratory and things like that. And I think that there's a reason why we don't get taught that anymore, because they don't want you to actually think analytically.
So To wrap up this particular discussion, I mean, we could go on for a very long time. It's a very in-depth topic, but what do you think, given the fact that MK Ultra is a matter of record? They just had we're talking in December that they've had another a dump of 1,200 pages, et cetera, that will be interesting to go through. But given that this was a factual matter of historical record, now what steps do you think should be taken to lessen the potential for such a program or programs to occur in the future, which, again, speculatively or not, have connection to the serial killer phenomenon?
That's a good question. There's a lot, like DARPA, a lot of very advanced research, nanotechnology, nanobots, and things like that that can influence or even the Neuralink or things like that. So we're really at the kind of science fiction phase of human existence where that coercive control that happens in cults can happen to the individual. And a lot of these people may have been Cremo is at trial right now. He was the guy who shot all those people, supposedly. Like, these people are around. How many of these are the Holmes, who was the Joker Batman killer in Colorado? How many of these people have been tampered with who do these shootings? And does the government have a purpose for it, whether it's gun control or what happened at Sandy Hook? So I think that laws should be set. I mean, we're in a situation where the government doesn't have control over the intel agencies. They're trying to kind of rein them in now, I think, under Trump. But for decades, they've really gotten away with murder, literal murder. But I think that if the public's aware of these processes that come out of MKUltra and whatever they're calling them today, I think one was called Dreamcatcher, one of the early ones, because they can literally farm for people, I think, through the internet. This one guy who drove up to Buffalo, he was really involved and shot people. He was kind of a racist killer, but he had an FBI handler online, like literal ex-FBI guy, supposedly. So they can operate these kind of, find your patsy, find your killer things, operations just through the internet now, which should scare the living daylights out of anybody. And if you have a gullible kid, you might want to monitor his or her web usage. But I think it's just something to be aware of. I think knowledge is a panacea, that if more people know that this happened and the history's fake, and the intelligence companies or intelligence agencies are able to do this, you'll see it much clearer when you see these guys like Ruth or Mangione pop out of nowhere and do things that are out of character. Like, Mangione's actions are way out of character, and you have to ask why these character changes have happened. So I think that we're in a kind of new phase where, this kind of mind tampering. They actually had a hearing where it was within the last year on Congress about how non-tactile things can adjust people's personality and drive them crazy, like literally target individual type stuff. I can show that. I'll have to put that on my social media, but we're in a kind of brave new world of mind control and mind war. And I think people just need to be aware of that.
Well, William, as usual, very, very interesting conversation. One that, again, there's so many facets to, but at least in the future moving forward, if people are aware of what you just talked about, it can only lead to more desirable outcomes in terms of personal safety and whatnot, because I think it can be understated given how ubiquitous mind control is in the modern era, the brave new world, as you say. Where can folks find your work?
My podcast is under William Ramsey Investigates. You can find that at whatever podcast distributor, Spotify or iTunes. My books you can buy from my website, William Ramsey Investigates. And then my documentaries, I have 5 of them. You can see them on my Patreon at William Ramsey Investigates.
Well, I want to thank you again for your time. I think if the fans were to look up your work and do some research for themselves. They definitely come away much more enlightened. So thank you again for your time.
Jack, thanks for the invite. It's great to be with you again. Appreciate it.
Well, that's it for this live special interview on the Hannibal TV on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification button so you don't miss any such great content. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss